Professor Davis, and we've got the Module 2 topics checklist this week. That finishes up Chapter 1, this review chapter on equation solving, and we're talking about sections 1.4, 1.5, and 1.6. So let's take a look at what we want to check over in section 1.4. First, that section is basically on solving quadratic equations, but doing it in several ways. So you want to look at the zero product property. That's where we set one side of the equation equal to 0, factor the other side, and then set each factor equal to 0 to solve that equation. The square root property, that property is used when there's no linear term with a quadratic equation. We have a quadratic term and a constant, so that's an easy way to solve quadratic equations. And make sure you write plus or minus when you take the square root of each side. And then completing the square. Completing the square acts somewhat as a prelude to the quadratic formula. So that's a technique that's nice to use, in particular when the leading coefficient is 1. And then we want to look at the next item, solving quadratic equations using the quadratic formula. So see examples 6 and 7 there. So you have to know the quadratic formula, so start to learn that form now. And also the important point there is not only plugging the numbers into the quadratic formula, but simplifying the irrational result from using the quadratic formula. And then finally in this section in 1.4, we want to talk about using the discriminant. Think of that as the radicand of the quadratic formula. And we want to use that to determine the number of real and imaginary solutions that we might have for a quadratic equation. So we want to practice problems 1 through 29 in that section. And those problems begin on page 27 of the summary book, ebook screen 1.4.22. And then in section 1.5, that's a section on applications of quadratic equations, and just a couple of them to look at there. First, these projectile motion applications. That's where you want to spend most of your time in looking at that. And then also solving geometric applications, where you have the Pythagorean theorem involved, and that lends itself to different types of quadratic equations. So you want to take a look at those examples. And then starting on summary page 32, ebook screen 1.5.19, we want to do, it was applications 5, 6, 7, and 8 there. I know I assigned a few more, but those are the ones you want to make sure you get to. And then finally, for this module, section 1.6 is kind of a catch-all, other types of equations. First, equations using factoring by grouping. That's a way we can solve cubic equations by grouping them into one linear factor and then a quadratic factor. So factoring by grouping is a way we can use to solve cubic equations. And then we want to talk about equations that are in quadratic form. I think those are sometimes called disguised quadratic equations. That's where we let a quartic term be represented by a quadratic term and then reduce the equation to a quadratic that we can solve and then back substitute. And then finally, solving square root equations. Those are examples 4 and 5. So the idea there is to isolate the radical term, square both sides of the equation, and then solve the resulting equation from that. The thing that's important to remember when solving square root equations is to make sure to check for extraneous roots. Sometimes there are roots to the equation which are not solutions to the problem. So when we're solving square root equations, we always want to check for extraneous roots. So in that section, section 1.6, we want to try problems 1, 3, 5, 6, and 9. And those start on ebook page, summary notebook page 36, screen 1.6.13 in your ebook. So that's the topics checklist for Module 2.